When was the last time you opened your eyes in the morning and a burst of joyful excitement filled your heart? Something in the air is a bit different. The sleepy sun rays haven't stretched far enough to reach your window yet, but you can already see it in the distance. There, where their angular glow cuts off the dark, at the cusp of the new day, something big awaits. Something bright, something unknown. It grips your whole body and moves you in an elated haze. You don't have to name it, you know it already, but high up in your head, you can already hear your heart pounding with the vigor of an ancient drum. Today is a day for adventure. Real life is complex. The older you grow, the more difficult it might be to capture this childlike wonder for the world. That's why it is not uncommon for people to seek this excitement for adventure in books and digital media. But what happens if said media fails to capture this feeling too? Well, you get something of the likes of Disney's Strange World 2022. And in today's video I want to explore how does one fail to capture adventure and why. I don't want to approach this issue as a critic or an expert, because such I am not. But I want us, for the purposes of this video, to become explorers and unravel the answers driven purely by our curiosity. The first step on our journey is knowing where to start from, and luckily for us, turns out Disney's Strange World 2022, just like Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire 2001, have one source of inspiration in common, namely Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth 1864. So it got me thinking that if I watch and or read all of these stories, we'll be able to discover the recipe for a good adventure story. Okay, so Journey to the Center of the Earth is set in 1863 and it tells the story of an eccentric geology professor, Otto Lidenbrock, and his nephew Axel, who discover and decode an ancient document that claims that a dormant volcano is the pathway to the center of the Earth, prompting the two of them to go along with their trusted guide Hans down the volcano, where they discover a fascinating prehistoric world. Their adventure gets cut short before they manage to reach the center for certain, as they get sent back to the surface by an active volcano located in southern Italy. Disney's Atlantis, The Lost World is set in 1914, and it tells the story of a young linguist, Milo Thatch, who decodes an ancient document that reveals the location of the lost city of Atlantis. Together with a crew of mercenaries, Milo gets on a submarine and plunges into uncharted ocean depths, where the crew travels through a dormant volcano and arrives at Atlantis, where they get greeted by its princess, Kida. Later on, the commander of the expedition is revealed to have nefarious reasons to be down there with the crew, as he wants to steal the crystal-like life source of Atlantis. After plenty of ups and downs, Milo and the crew manage to save the day. The crew returns, well rewarded with Atlantis treasures, and Milo remains underwater with Kida as he continues to follow his vocation of being a linguist. Now, let's see what happens in Strange World. The story there revolves around a trio: a father, Jaeger, son called Searcher, and a grandson called Ethan. They live in this land of Alonia that is surrounded by mountains, and Jaeger's life mission has always been going beyond said mountains, whereas Searcher has always been more interested in discovering different plant species. The movie opens with Jaeger and Searcher amidst one expedition, at long last parting their ways, as Jaeger wants to continue the exploration and Searcher, who has just discovered a weird electrical plant, wants to go home and create a new way of life based on the plant's special properties. 25 years later, we're shown that Searcher now has a wife and a son, and they all live peacefully on their farm producing electrical plants. They have changed the whole infrastructure of their city by introducing this new power source, and Searcher is enjoying his success until one day his father's old crew that had followed him back home 25 years ago now comes to tell him the electrical plant seems to be dying and they must go on an expedition to find out why. Searcher is reluctant at first, but due to circumstances, him and his wife and his son end up joining the expedition. They travel into a giant sinkhole beneath the mountain, where the roots of the electrical plant called Pandu are located. Underneath the surface, the crew finds a strange world. Surprisingly for them, they also end up finding Searcher's father, who spent 25 years in the land down below. Searcher, his father, and his son are shown to have conflicts and misunderstandings stemming from their lack of ability to understand each other, which they supposedly overcome by the end of the movie. In the conclusion of the movie, it is revealed that the strange world they've been traversing are the insides of a giant turtle on which their land is located, and the electrical plant is a parasite which was killing said turtle. The crew ends up destroying the plant and restoring the natural balance. You might have noticed it already, but there is a glaring problem with Strange World, and that's that it wants to say so much. It wants to be an adventure story that comments on generational differences, criticizes the old, and tackles on environmental discourse. We find that reflected in the words of Dr. Elizabeth Reiga and Dr. Stuart Sumida, two scientists consulting for the movie, who, when asked about their main takeaway of the film, replied, Reiga: my favorite character in this is in fact Ethan's mother, and in part because we're seeing a multicultural family. You see her face in Ethan's, you can see her husband's face. That multiculturalism and multi-population approach, without making it the point of the story, I think is powerful. Not only that, but the film's attitude towards same-sex relationships. Sumida. And one of the things that is an obvious message in the film, of course, is that we need to take care of the planet we're living on. Let's worry about what's really important. Saving our planet, respecting our planet, respecting the strange world that we have damaged, that we live in. These answers are a bit bizarre, but they seem to imply that amongst the top priorities of this movie were having an environmental message and promoting diversity. While those goals are lovely, they're not amongst the components of a good adventure story. Many adventure stories are not diverse and don't comment on the environment, yet they have stood the test of time and have for years been capturing the imagination of people from all over the world. So, what makes for a good adventure story? And to be more precise, a good Jules Verne-esque adventure story. After pondering on this for a while, I have come to three important components. Firstly, realism, that has two subcategories. Believable environment that ensures a stark contrast between the normal starting point world and the world where the adventure unravels, and believable characters. Secondly, a sense of danger, and thirdly, a sense of wonder. Let's explore how they're handled in the aforementioned three pieces of media. First, Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth opens like this. On the 24th of May, 1863, my uncle, Professor Lidenbrock, rushed into his little house, number 19 Königstrasse, one of the oldest streets in the oldest portion of the city of Hamburg. He lived in his own little house, a structure half brick, half wood, with a gable cut into steps. It looked upon one of those winding canals which intersect each other in the middle of the ancient quarter of Hamburg, and which the Great Fire of 1842 had fortunately spared. It is true, the old house stood slightly off the perpendicular and bulged out a little towards the street. Its lines wanted accuracy, but after all, it stood firm, thanks to an elm which buttressed in the front and which often in spring sent its young sprays through the window panes. And the professor's study, that study of his, was a museum and nothing else. Specimens of everything known in mineralogy lay there in their places in perfect order and correctly named, divided into inflammable, metallic, and lithoid minerals. As you can see, we're transported in a world that we know. We're given a date and a year. Just by hearing 1863, we already know how those people dressed, how they carried themselves, how they lived. Moreover, we've seen that old street before, be it on a trip around Europe or somewhere on the internet. We've seen that old house slightly tilted towards the street too, and we have at least once dreamt of peeking into a study like the one described, all museum-like, full of scientific samples and gadgets. True, for a modern reader the setting is a bit old and distant, but it doesn't feel foreign. Even better, through the passage of time and additional media, this setting not only is familiar to us, but it's already connected to a sense of mystery and this bubbling excitement of we're in the abode of someone smart, passionate about their interests, someone curious about the world who can take us on an adventure. And just a few chapters later, when we sink deep into the crater of a volcano to find within its heart a breathtaking prehistorical world where huge monsters fight to the death in a giant underworld ocean illuminated by strange electrical light, we smile, content that our intuition when we were in that familiar museum-like study was right. We were, indeed, in the abode of an adventurer, and to an adventure he did take us. Similarly, after a brief mythological preview, Atlantis the Lost Empire takes us to 1914 in the Smithsonian Institution, a real-life location that happens to be the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. We see Milo preparing passionately to speak to a group of investors about his discoveries. Maybe because my own father is geologist and I grew up in museums, in my heart they are the home of adventurers, of people who want to know more about the world, who care to understand us and what's surrounding us better. It is the hub where they meet after great adventures to share their knowledge with the rest of the world. Museums to me feel warm and familiar, but even if you're not as passionate about them as I am, you're still familiar with what a museum is and what happens inside of one. You don't have to do any mental heavy lifting to recognize a museum as a familiar place. So wait, you'd say, does this mean that we can't have a good adventure story unless our starting point setting is a scientist's room or a museum? Not at all. To give you a quick example of other adventure stories, The Lord of the Rings had its Shire, and Asuka of the Valley of the Wind had its valley. It is not about the exact location, but rather how familiar it feels. As already mentioned, this sense of familiarity is what boosts the wonder and amazement that we are to experience once we end up in the world of adventure. It also gives the adventurer an anchor point, a safe haven to think back to while on their dangerous quest. It's the place worth surviving for. It's what's giving them willpower to continue. So, with all that in mind, let's examine the setting of Strange World. The writers of the movie seem to have been familiar with the idea of contrast being important because, as The Hollywood Reporter article states, the characters reside in the fictional Avalonia, which features a palette including white and orange. We wanted to create a kind of utopia, a warm, nostalgic feeling to emphasize that this is a wonderful culture that everybody enjoys. In contrast, when the explorers venture into the strange new world that feels alive, the filmmakers avoided earth tones and leaned into reds and magentas. Here is the issue though, a color palette cannot hold nostalgia on its own. And even worse, the whole concept of utopia and nostalgia is self-exclusionary. Nostalgia, by definition, is a feeling of pleasure and also slight sadness when you think about things that happened in the past. Utopia is something humans have never experienced on Earth. But on top of that, the Avalonia we're shown doesn't seem familiar. The weird neon green electrical plant, the steampunk aesthetic, they're not inherently bad, but they don't feel cozy on their own. And the thing is, this issue could have been fixed quite easily, because nostalgia isn't predominantly looks, it's predominantly feelings. I'll give you an example with the electrical plant that they harvest. Scrap those random kids that serve no purpose and leave just Ethan and his crush. Have them walk through the pando. Maybe have them talking about their aspirations. Have Ethan and his crush squat, hiding amongst the pando, looking at each other, talking. And that's it. Even though pando is a weird electrical plant, we've now connected it to an experience that we know. That awkward but sweet first love in the quiet countryside, something that feels tangible and nostalgic, something that feels like home. This not only will provide the contrast of the familiar and unfamiliar between the two worlds, but it will also add to the gravity of the choice of destroying the pando later on in the story. It is one thing to make the decision to destroy the weird electrical thingy that you kinda didn't enjoy harvesting anyways, and it's a completely different thing to destroy the place where you and your first crush had some of your most beautiful memories together. Additionally, we could have spent more time in Avalonia. I can't help but feel that the scene that we got where Searcher and his son were in Avalonia handing out packages of pando to random citizens was included just so that we can show diverse people living in the city. But instead, we could have had Ethan, for example, have one meaningful relationship with one of the citizens there. Maybe have him be the student of that girl in the wheelchair, who, let's say, is his science teacher, and who's unlocked in him that craving for exploration that he carries in his soul just like his grandfather. Maybe have him secretly try to go beyond the borders of his father's farm, and then going back to the city to tell the science teacher all about what he saw and what he learned. This way we can spend more time organically in Avalonia, seeing the characters interact with the environment, seeing them belong in it, and having it mean something to them. That's no longer a random utopian city, it's the place where Ethan's cherished teacher lives. I'm no writer, but those just come on top of my head as very basic, very simple ways to make a place familiar and meaningful. If your starting point place is too abstract and unfamiliar, you can't just hope that the vibes and the colors will carry the sense of nostalgia. You have to rely on the people and their relationships to ground your setting back into familiarity. Speaking of people, let's talk about realism and how it's handled when it comes to the characters. I won't linger much on Atlantis, but as far as Milo's character goes, he's realistic to a point that I actually know a person just like him in real life. Every time I see his idealism, his passion for the dead languages, and this pure heated excitement and concentration on a task, I think to myself, oh yeah, I know this person. I've talked to him. Even the little details of how he's perceived by a group of people who don't share his passion per se, initially disinterested and later on charmed by his pure nature and excitement, even those little details are so familiar they don't for a second take me out of the movie. They are absolutely immersive and relatable to what I've observed. On the other hand, Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth takes a slightly different approach to character writing. Instead of having simply familiar characters, we have vessels. Axel is a vessel for us, the readers. He's rational, fearful, but curious and open to follow an adventurer, even though his common sense often begs to differ. He's a normal human just like us, he wants to be part of an adventure, but if it was solely up to him, maybe he wouldn't go because his self-preservation would prevail. On the contrary, his uncle is eccentric, passionate, brave to the point of insanity. His fearless approach is what makes the adventure possible. Without this little bit of eccentricity, they'd never move a step further from home. He is a vessel for the passion for adventure. At the same time, neither Axel nor the uncle are one-dimensional. Axel is cautious but brave enough to follow his uncle on an adventure, and his uncle isn't careless and neglectful. He takes calculated risks, he's observant, he's a good leader. In times of need, he sacrifices his own needs to help his nephew, saving the last bit of water for him, guiding him, encouraging him. In this way, even though the characters are to an extent vessels for ideas, they still possess very necessary human depth and nuance. Something that is nowhere to be found in Strange World. The characters in Strange World genuinely make no sense to me. The grandfather, Jaeger, is an explorer who has it as a life mission to go beyond the mountains surrounding Avalonia. The thing is, in my brain it doesn't compute why would he mind his son's curiosity towards different plant species. Explorers, by definition, are passionate about exploring the world surrounding them. Even if he has that one ultimate goal, nothing is stopping him from letting his son explore foreign plants for a little while. And it doesn't make sense that he'd be so stubborn to return home, analyze the plant, and then potentially continue the exploration again. Historically, explorers have been traveling back and forth from their homeland. They have been making herbariums of different plant species, bringing innovation and new knowledge back to their community and returning to explore further. And I know the movie is trying to be a metaphor at some point, and so me wanting the characters to make sense is me wanting a little too much, because bro, actually, it's so deep if you think about it, bro. The older generation is set on one path and they refuse to seek an alternative route or lifestyles. No. Just no. If you want this metaphor, handle it better. The explorer being mad about his son wanting to explore plants just doesn't make sense. And it isn't the only thing that doesn't make sense. Jaeger spent 25 years of his life down below. I'm 24 right now, so I'm trying to wrap around my head the gravity of the number 25 in human years. If you've read Robinson Crusoe or have heard about any unethical human experiments, you know what solitude does to a person. It's actually a really interesting concept to explore, but no, Jaeger seems unfazed. Nothing in his reaction screams disturbed and lost, and someone who hasn't seen humanity in 25 years. As a fellow YouTuber, the little platoon, who does far more eloquent analysis than I do, likes to say sometimes, the fact that the characters are off-screen doesn't mean that things aren't happening to them. Again, if we look at Jaeger's character as the surface-level metaphor of the old being stuck in their ways and not admitting it, I can see why they didn't bother to have him experiencing the psychological side effects of an unfathomably long solitude, but it just doesn't work, because he seems hollow as a character, and now I don't care about him, and therefore I don't care about a metaphor. A direct consequence of Jaeger's unrealistic behavior is Searcher's life experience. I'll tell you a short personal anecdote of mine. My father and I love going on explorations like Jaeger and Searcher. Well, we aren't trying to find what's beyond the mountain, but we usually have some set goal or location. I am the searcher in our dynamic. I stop along the way for every plant and every mushroom and every butterfly. I'm the one who likes bringing plants home and growing them. And you know what? Never have I ever thought, man, I hate these explorations because I'm a grower, not an explorer. If you have such an incredible passion for plants, those explorations are your heaven. Those explorations are what introduces you to new plant species, to new possibilities and opportunities. Suggesting that Searcher loves exploring plants, but the moment he finds something cool he settles and never again searches for any new plants is bizarre. Having a character's passion for something die down just because he found one cool thing is illogical. It doesn't feel human, it doesn't feel real. Ethan, the kid, isn't spared too when it comes to the lack of character believability. He's supposed to be taking after his grandfather in adventurous spirit, but we never actually see him being passionate about exploration and adventure. We know he sometimes thinks he is, but we never see him truly acting upon it. Being adventurous is not going to search for your father when people say you should wait, just so you can walk around a little bit, mention how real life looks like your card games.
This is just like Primal Outpost.
Run scarily through a cave and note how this story sounds so cool and you can impress your crush with it.
Yeah, so how was my weekend? Went through a nightmare tunnel to rescue my dad. No big deal.
That's what people on the outside think that adventurous people think. A real adventurous spirit is something you can't explain truly. You feel like a detective and the world is one huge mystery that you need to uncover. You constantly feel the need to go check and touch and take pictures and samples, read what other people have said on such matters, ponder, observe somewhere, go further, wreck your head until you find the answer. An explorer usually doesn't put themselves in difficult situations because they think it's so cool. They're usually driven by passion that sometimes makes them overlook the dangers. The lack of realism in the characters carries out throughout all aspects of their existence. One fact I found particularly interesting is that people didn't find them to look like realistic farmers. Now, to me personally, they didn't seem realistic to begin with, but honestly, I tried giving them the benefit of the doubt. I said to myself, listen, Dusky, you live in a different continent. Your country isn't USA level of development, maybe they do stuff there differently. But then I saw this snippet from a YouTube clip.
I find it hard to believe they are farmers. They seem more like a Californian hipster's version of an ideal farmer more than anything. For example, in the Suits episode of Love, Death and Robots, the characters are simplistic but believable. They actually remind me of people that I know, and most of them, grew up on farms. You know the type of person, the one who'll go for the calm, simplistic environment while doing all these back-breaking physical jobs. But not in Strange World. No, these are not your typical farmers. They have steampunk aesthetics. They eat avocado toast in the morning, play card games in the evening, and dance to Electric Swing in the night.
And now I know that I'm not alone in this feeling. And here, you may finally say, Dusky, you keep speaking about realism in a fictional adventure story. Why are you so obsessed with things feeling real? I'll tell you why. But first let me tell you, I didn't discover the wheel. People have been knowing about how important realism in fictional stories is. So let's first take a look at how they used it in their works, and afterwards I'll tell you why I personally like it. When it comes to Jules Verne's works, it's a well-known fact that he put huge amounts of effort to be as accurate as possible to science, at least the science as people understood it in the 1860s. Author Kat Shivkova writes for the Retrospect Journal. Journey to the Center of the Earth encapsulated a growing scientific investigation in the 19th century over what truly lay at the Earth's core. Verne uses Humphrey Davy's theory of volcanoes throughout the entire novel to substantiate his story. Another important piece of information is that during the time he wrote his adventure stories, Jules Verne himself was traveling quite a lot. According to Britannica, during these years, Verne settled with his family in Amiens and made a brief trip to the United States to visit New York City and in Niagara Falls. During this period, he also purchased several yachts and sailed to many European countries. To an extent, he lived the adventures he wrote about. Because Strange World was partially inspired by pulp fiction, I felt it appropriate to include a piece of the process of writing good pulp fiction.
One thing about Edwin Hubbard as a writer, it was that his realism is what made his stories sell so much. And what made it that way was because of the fact he was an accomplished pilot, because he was an accomplished seaman. He traveled all over the place. He did all kinds of explorations, climbing into volcanoes even at one point.
Some magazine editors began to demand that writing be held to a consistently higher standard, imposing greater rigor and better storylines. For example, in 1939, one of the best writers of that period, John W. Campbell, was hired to edit the science fiction pulp Astounding magazine. He had a scientific background as a student of nuclear physics. He told the best science fiction writers of the time to gear up and write more intelligent stories for a more intelligent readership. This was considered by many to be a huge development in science fiction writing.
As you can see, realism was again an integral part of the process. Even Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire knew of the importance of realism as the production team visited museums and old army installations to study the technology of the early 20th century. And they traveled underground in New Mexico's Carlsbad's caverns to view the subterranean trail, which would serve as a model for the environment in the film. Realism is essential in order for the audience to allow for plausible deniability. We know that the stories we're told are fictional, but in order for us to care, we need that relatable factor. When everything else feels real, we can allow ourselves to imagine that those few aspects that are fictional could truly happen. When the whole experience seems illogical and unrealistic, you stop caring. It's no longer a story, it's a bunch of colorful nonsense. If you search for critiques of Strange World, you hear many people saying that they didn't care about the characters. That's because the characters have to earn your care. In the beginning, they're random strangers. They need to be written in such a way that you either relate to them or empathize with them. But when they seem unhuman, you just don't feel. You're acutely aware of how nonsensical this is. And why would you put your emotions in the front lines and hurt them for something that's so blatantly unrealistic? So, now that we have explored how Strange World fails at realism, let's discuss why. You already heard how other writers achieved realism through partially experiencing the adventures they spoke about. Unfortunately, in a true postmodernist fashion, Strange World is, and correct me if I'm wrong please, but it seems to be predominantly based on other pieces of media prior to it. I'm not saying it's bad to be inspired by other works, but every piece of art is a process of filtering reality and the personal to combine it in a beautiful piece. So, if you draw inspiration only from other art, like a game of telephone, you start losing the believability and the relatable factor. Strange World did try to combat that by consulting scientists on the anatomy of animals so that they make the strange world true to what the insides of a turtle would look like, and they did a fantastic job, but that's simply not enough. Realism stemming from the personal experiences and explorations of the writers needs to be in every aspect of the production, lest it wants to be a cool gimmick and nothing more. Moreover, I appreciate that they consulted experts and even a farmer, but I firmly believe that's not enough. Go to a farm for 2 weeks, 3 even, live there, work there. You can't just consult a farmer. You'll be getting their filtered experiences. Live life and write about it as you experience it. Stop writing about other people's retellings of an experience. But anyways, now let's move on to what I found to be the second component of a good adventure story, and that's the sense of danger. This one is very closely associated to the realism one. Usually, in an adventure story, you know that your main characters will survive, which actually makes the writer's work even more challenging because they constantly need to make you question everything and anxiously bite your nails and try to convince yourself not to turn to the last page so you see, do the main characters actually survive or not? At no point in the story should you be able to tell yourself, it's whatever, they'll be alright. An adventure story is driven by the sense of danger. It is that high stakes, high rewards an adventure brings. Yes, at home you're safe, but you stay in darkness of the unknown, whereas The adventure brings you knowledge, but your life is at risk now. So how do writers usually combat this issue of the audience knowing everything will be alright at the end? Well, I'm not a writer, but from what I've noticed, they either make the situation so dire that you can't think of what possibly could save the character, or they hurt secondary characters and let us watch the immense psychological impact it has on the main ones. Jules Verne is particularly good at capturing a sense of claustrophobic fear and paralyzing anxiety that makes the viewer forget all hope. It would take quite a while for me to read out to you his words, but I'll leave on the screen a few pages from his near-death descriptions, so you can read them if you're very curious on how he goes about it. Atlantis: The Lost Empire 2 takes the concept of peril quite seriously, and we get a scene like the beginning one where an enormous number of the Atlantis population dies a horrible death, and later on a scene where a big part of the crew dies after an underwater attack, and we get to watch the devastated survivors mourning them. The main characters survive, yes, but the loss has left an impact on them. So with all that in mind, here's how a pterodactyl thingy murders a pilot, and no one ever acknowledges it.
A few moments later.
Come on, Ethan. We're gonna have the best time. You like board games, right? We have the best games.
Yep, I'm letting you let it sink in. This guy has been a crew member for years. Those of you who have worked in the military or any other important team jobs will know way better than me what a crew member means. Sometimes they're as family, they have saved you, you have saved them. You probably shared dreams and hopes, and now this person is gone. And no one is acknowledging it. It was made out to be a gimmick. From this point on, nothing can feel dangerous. Nothing has the gravity because those characters are unable to experience gravity. They flow lightweight, running from the goofy dangers, and I bite my nails not to skip ahead, not because I want to know will they survive or not, but because I'm profoundly bored. It's time to discuss the last component of a good adventure story, and potential reasons as to why Strange World failed at it. A sense of wonder. Out of everything we discussed so far, I think a sense of wonder is the most difficult to portray in art because a sense of wonder is not looking at something and saying it looks cool. A sense of wonder is a mindset. You as a writer have to embody it in order to infect other people with it. Yes, it's like an infection, but a good one. It is not logical, it doesn't have rules. You just feel it, you just are, and it is carried through your works. Instead of telling you about it in a surgical way, I'll try to share with you some tips on how to capture it in your own lives. But first, let's discuss the potential reasons as to why the writers of Strange World, and people in general, might lack it in their lives. An interesting fact about the sense of wonder is that it can be won or lost. We discussed Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was written in the so-called positivist period of Jules Verne's writings. But do you know what this period was followed by? A pessimistic one. Increasingly, Verne turned away from pro-science tales of exploration in favor of exploring the dangers of technology wrought by hubris-filled scientists. According to Britannica, this change of focus paralleled certain adversities in the author's personal life. The author's soul is a mirror. Whether they want it or not, we're going to see it on the page or in the movie. Their works are pieces of their perceived reality. Reality. A bit ironic given how much time I spent blabbering about how important realism is for a good fictional story, as it is exactly reality that kills wonder. How can the modern person preserve their sense of amusement and adventure in a time when we're served the world on a platter? Well, not a platter, but at least a smartphone screen. We see highlighted and curated the most amazing and most vile of all of the world. We see things our ancestors could only dream about seeing, but we also see tragedies on a scale that our ancestors might have not been able to fathom, that we right now might not be able to fathom. So on one hand, we have a saturation of wonders that combined start feeling mundane. And on the other hand, we have great tragedies, which all combined start feeling suffocating. In such an environment, the writers of Strange World were given the task to write an adventure story. And it's not hidden at all that even though they were following the required directions at heart, they were preoccupied with something completely different. Feels like the creators of Strange World were of that more pessimistic outlook on life. What is there to discover? We've seen it all. Deadly weapons, destruction of the environment, economic crashes, misery. And it seems that they blame the older generation for those issues.
The objective isn't to kill or destroy monsters. You're just supposed to build a working civilization utilizing the environment around you.
Yeah, I don't get this game. Me neither.
They also seem to blame themselves, and they consider their issues to be stemming from the trauma that the older generation inflicted upon them.
You know what? You want bad guys? Fine! You two are the bad guys!
To me, they don't seem like the kind of people who can capture adventure because that's not their story to tell. That's not their view on the world. And I feel like it would have been much better if instead of masking their true writing desires behind poorly written adventure story, they just took the Nasuka of the Valley of the Wind approach and simply focused on what they were truly passionate about. In a way that has more depth and hopefully more humanness and empathy. But I know that's easier said than done. Writers are controlled by studios and goals. But you, my dear sweet audience, you have a choice. So, now that we're approaching the end of this video, let's talk about ways you can capture the sense of wonder back into your life. I'll tell you what I do for myself, and if you like it, you can apply some of it to your life too. Since a sense of wonder is a mindset, I felt like I needed a catalyst, something to remind me to view the world a bit differently. And so I got myself one adventure bag. It actually doesn't have to be a bag, it could be whatever sort of object, a pen, a pencil, a notebook. But it has to be special. I started carrying this bag on trips with me, and every time I do, I imagine myself being on a great adventure. I carry it to museums, to parks, to rivers, to forests. It doesn't matter does it match my outfit or not. What matters is that it's an adventure bag, and every time I carry it around, it lives up to its name. Then secondly, and arguably way more importantly, I realized that no one can take away from me the joy of discovering. You observe the world in your own unique way. Own your view of the world. Find what draws you in, what makes your ears prick, what makes your eyes glisten. And if there is no such thing for you, go out with the feeling that today might be the day you discover it. Wouldn't that be so adventurous? Thirdly, realize that you haven't seen it all. You might have seen all of the world on social media, but if you settle on that, you'll be participating in the postmodernist game of telephone, where you discover the world second-hand or third-hand or fourth. Instead, realize you don't personally know all the humans in the world. Neither have you been to every street and corner of the place where you live in. Go explore, compare them to what you've seen on the media, find the differences, find the similarities, experience it on your own. And lastly, if you happen to know the feeling of seeing the sunset over and over again and still being excited about it, try applying it to your life. Don't allow for the world to start feeling mundane. Look closely. The wonder you remember from your childhood never abandoned you. It's still there. You're just a little bit older now, and your vision has gotten a little bit bad. Maybe all you need is a pair of adventure spectacles.